The Supreme Court hears arguments this morning on a major national question, the question of whether a single judge can make a decision.
Sorry, my lawyer, the people's defender, the people's public defender, Alex Lull overruled, called me and was like, "Oh, what? You're live?" Which is shocking. All right. Now we're going to get to domestic news. Supreme Court is weighing on a judge's power on policies nationwide in birthright citizenship cases. Now, the reason why the Supreme Court is weighing on this hyper-specific angle on birthright citizenship is because tackling the issue of birthright citizenship directly is a bridge too far that even Trump's legal team understands would be declared unconstitutional instantly. Okay? So for that reason, they are trying to massage, they're trying to basically undermine the power of lower courts on actions that they declare are taken by the federal government. Okay? This is a Supreme Court case that is supposed to be about whether or not the federal government can take away birthright citizenship, which is unconstitutional, right? Doing that is unconstitutional. Birthright citizenship is in the Constitution. But because they can't directly tackle that issue, because even the supermajority conservative Supreme Court would obviously look at that and go, this is unconstitutional, get the f out of here. They've decided that the angle that they can tackle the issue on is by way of seeing if district courts have the power to issue injunctions and to stop the federal government from engaging in unconstitutional actions.
That applies to the entire country. The details of the case involve President Trump's executive order to restrict which children born in the U.S. can be U.S. citizens, also known as birthright citizenship. Jan Crawford is at the Supreme Court for us, watching it all. Jan, good morning. What's at stake here?
Well, good morning. So the Trump administration is saying that one federal judge can't dictate national policy for everyone, while opponents say the alternative would be legal chaos. Now, we talked to an undocumented pregnant woman. She's seeking asylum. She asked us not to show her face.
This expecting mother says she dreams of her baby girl being born an American citizen. She worries without birthright citizenship, her baby could be deported back to Guatemala with her if she's forced to leave, where they both would be unsafe. But judges across the country are rejecting President Trump's efforts to end automatic birthright citizenship, 3 of those judges applying their rulings nationwide. President Trump has blasted those decisions, calling on the Supreme Court to act. Juan Perano, head of the nation's largest Hispanic civil rights organization, disagrees.
What is your concern if the court says no nationwide injunctions?
Well, then you're going to have lawsuits effectively filed in every single state. It's going to tie up the courts, and individuals may lose their protections under the Constitution if that happens.
The Obama and Biden administrations opposed national injunctions, arguing judges in conservative states like Texas, where opponents chose to file lawsuits, were dictating national policy. Now the shoe is on the other foot. A CBS News analysis of more than 300 lawsuits filed against
Yes, I'm going to watch the new Noel Sampson video later, yes.
The Trump administration found that outside of Washington, D.C., the most are in liberal Massachusetts, followed by Maryland, California, and New York. West Virginia Attorney General J.B. McCuskey says that shows why it's a problem when these rulings apply nationwide.
People begin to look at circuit judges as an extension of the political process. And that is fundamentally disastrous for the way that the public views the...
What are you talking about? It's a part of the separation of powers. What are we... There is no... I don't think there's any legal claim here. I don't think there's any valid legal claim here, okay? Like, the idea that you can... the idea that you can literally undermine the power of the judicial force in this country, the power of the courts here, because you want to expand the federal, the powers of the executive is ridiculous. It is also unconstitutional in and of itself. I don't even think the Supreme Court will go in this direction because it also defangs the Supreme Court. It defangs the entirety of the justice system and its power. Yeah, which is why you're seeing people freaking the f out over this, by the way. SCOTUS betrayal. Amy Coney Barrett slams Trump's legal team on birthright citizenship executive order, siding with liberal Kagan. What do you really think? Should women be allowed on the Supreme Court? And it's not just Amy Coney Barrett either. Brett Kavanaugh has also criticized this too. Like, the only time you'll get some motion on this is probably like Clarence Thomas, you know? And even then, I don't know. I mean, this is yet another instance where we are going to find out if there is any sort of if there's any sort of power left in the Supreme Court or the judicial system, or if they are going to completely defang it. It makes no sense.
Impartiality and the power of our court system.
Disastrous.
But can't they just reverse this when a Democrat gets in the White House? Beautiful take, El Duderino. When is that going to happen, you think? How is that going to happen, you think? You think there will be ever another moment where Democrats come back to power after this? I just don't know.
Why?
Because the court is nothing if it doesn't have its integrity.
Now, the use of these sweeping injunctions has been growing significantly in recent years. There have been 39 of them so far, blocking President Trump's policies in his second term. Tony?
All right, Jan, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
The Supreme Court is hearing arguments over nationwide injunctions blocking President Trump's executive order ending birthright citizenship. 3 federal appeals courts have kept the order on hold, finding it very likely unconstitutional. President Trump argues the lower courts exceeded their authority. Now he's asking the Supreme Court to lift the injunctions or at least allow the administration to start planning for the change. So far, the justices have pressed the Trump administration's attorney on the potential impact of eliminating those injunctions. And Justice Brett Kavanaugh waded into the immediate consequences of the order going into effect.
On the day after it goes into effect, this is just a very practical question how this is going to work. What do hospitals do with a newborn? What do states do with a newborn?
I don't think they do anything different. What the executive order says in Section 2 is that federal officials do not accept documents that have the wrong designation of citizenship from people who are subject to the executive order.
How are they going to know that?
The states can continue to, the federal officials will have to figure that out.
How?
So you could imagine a number of ways that the federal officials could.
Such as?
Such as they could require a showing of, documentation showing legal presence in the country. For a temporary visitor, for example, they could see whether they're on a B-1 visa, which would exclude kind of the birthright citizenship in that context.
For all the newborns? Is that how that's going to work?
Again, we don't know because the agencies were never given the opportunity to formulate the guidance. They would had 30
They're only
days.
going to have 30 days to do this. You think they can get it together in time?
They're under. That's what the executive order instructs them to do, and hopefully they will do so. Again, it's a speculative and hypothetical scenario because they were enjoined from even starting that process.
And now the immigrant advocates' attorneys arguing against lifting the injunction. Let's bring in senior White House correspondent Selena Wang and constitutional lawyer Jeff Lewis for more. Jeff, the scope of this hearing is limited to the injunctions, but some of the justices, like we just heard there,
Another
are
RFK
also talking a little bit about the merits of the case
archetype.
at large. What do you make of that?
Well, none of the justices have touched the merits in terms of weighing in on whether or not they think the executive order is enforceable. Instead, they're asking the question about whether they need to discuss the merits in connection with the injunction. And I think at the end of the day, the opinion issued by this judge or by this court is not going to touch the merits of this case.
Selena, what sticks out to you from how the Trump administration...
Am I living in crazy town right now? Is Kavanaugh really the voice of reason on this issue right now? There are a couple things looking at the Supreme Court. Where do I begin? Okay, number one, I don't believe in genuine differences in opinion in terms of interpretations of the Constitution. I think that it's just a way to intellectualize a reactionary framework that you're operating off of. And it's purely partisan. Having said that, there are additional motivations to, at the very least, present the Supreme Court as an independent institution to preserve its legitimacy. Okay? And that motivation is very powerful and plays a role in why the Supreme Court sometimes decides against the right-wing government and its actions. Another very powerful motivator for the Supreme Court judges, the Supreme Court justices, is also to continue letting the Supreme Court have power, okay, the persuasive power that the courts currently have. So this is an instance where I believe the reason why the right-wing Supreme Court justices would not favor the side of the administration is for those two additional reasons. One, because it defangs the power that the judicial structure has, the power that the courts have. It directly undermines the separation of powers. And therefore, because it directly undermines the separation of powers, it also undermines the legitimacy of the Supreme Court as an institution. If they were to aggressively rubber stamp every unconstitutional decision of the current administration, then it would brick the system in its entirety. It would render the courts useless. And that is the reason I think as to why you hear right-wing justices in this matter, as they did in the previous due process matter that took place in front of the Supreme Court, where they had a unanimous decision against the Trump administration, but did so in a very cowardly way, where they could hide behind the language that they use, where they said we would want you to facilitate the return of Kilmar Abrego Garcia. They will come out against the administration. They will come out against the administration because it directly undermines their institutional legitimacy, and it undermines the power that the courts have altogether. Do you understand?
Is making their case.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the core questions here is, can an individual district judge block the president's policy nationwide? The Trump administration is arguing that the ability of these federal judges to do that is forcing them to race from court to court, trying to win every case that challenges their policies. They argue that this is creating an unfair playing field, saying that those who challenge them can win anywhere, while the Trump administration has to, quote, win everywhere. Now, that was met from a lot of skepticism from Justice Sotomayor, who said that the argument, quote, makes no sense.
Hasanabi about to have a second Russia won't invade Ukraine moment. I mean, I'm not super confident in my assessment. I'm just saying this is why I think they will decide against this instead of rubber stamping this decision. If they do rubber stamp this decision, I mean, that's terrifying. Here, I'll give you motivations as to why they might rubber stamp this decision. It's the same as previous court cases involving previous decisions that the Supreme Court entertained involving like due process. The reason why they would take like a middle of the road approach on severe game changing institution breaking decisions like this one would be out of fear, out of self-preservation, out of the fear that they would trigger a constitutional crisis, which would then effectively destroy the power of the Supreme Court. Do you understand? So even if they were to rubber stamp this decision, it would most likely still be out of self-preservation, because in their weird calculations, they think it's even worse if there is if a constitutional crisis is triggered.
Sense whatsoever, saying that it would limit the ability of the district court, but also the Supreme Court to offer nationwide relief. Now, there was one significant...
Have they not already triggered a constitutional crisis with their decision on Kilmar? No, I think that's why they used facilitate instead of effectuate, and left the decision back to lower courts to continue fighting this battle against the Trump administration. Kick the can down the road. But, I mean, depending on your perspective, I feel like we're already hotly inside of a constitutional crisis. Like it doesn't really matter. Like these guys are doing everything in their power to completely gut the institutions until they can rebuild them. And that is going to be the second phase of this. First, you destroy the legitimacy of the courts, or you defang the power that the courts have considering that most of their power is just persuasive to begin with. And if you don't follow their persuasive power, then, you know, what can the courts do? They don't have an army, right? And then they change the rules and they start rewriting the rules to make it legal, to make their actions legal. Okay, this is how it works. We haven't reached, at least for a lot of the Trump administration's agenda, we have not reached the Nuremberg race laws moment yet. But that is where this is headed. First, they defang the courts, then they change the rules and make their actions legal and make it illegal to resist. And then they use the courts to process every single person expeditiously and within the confines of the new American legal structure. And this has happened throughout history, obviously. It's one of the most famous examples of this is slavery, right? A perfectly legal process. It was illegal to free slaves. It was legal to have slaves. Okay, just like in Nazi Germany, it was illegal to be Jewish, and that Jews and other political dissidents and other minority groups were considered non-citizens. They were effectively removed from citizenship, which is ironically exactly what the Trump administration is trying to do. Okay, and resisting against that was illegal. We have not reached that level yet, but I fear that eventually we will. Wait, so the court isn't ruling on the order is legal? They're just ruling on whether or not the lower courts can block it? Yes. Because the Supreme Court, yes, that is, it's a legal trickery, which Republicans love doing all the time. This decision is not whether or not the Trump administration can at the executive, by executive mandate, by executive order, just decide to abolish birthright citizenship. This is not the Supreme Court issuing a decision on the constitutionality of birthright citizenship. This is the Supreme Court issuing a decision on whether or not state like federal judges can issue injunctions at the state level that impacts the executive orders, like stop executive orders at the federal level. And their argument is that, you got woke judges in woke states that basically are operating as political operatives and undermining the goals of the democratically elected right-wing government. Except if federal judges were not allowed to issue injunctions against the executive authority against the federal government, then they have no power whatsoever. Like, that's kind of the point. Also, the woke judges that they're talking about are like Reagan appointees. These are conservative judges as well. Like, the people that they're considering activist judges are quite literally activist judges, but in the opposite direction. Like, they were appointed as activist judges for the right. They just still happen to believe in maintaining some aspects of the Constitution.
Exchange where she drew an analogy to what if the next president, a new president, issued an executive order banning ownership of guns. She asked if the court would have to, quote, sit back and...
Well, why defang the courts? They control the legislative branch. Why not change the law now? What do you mean? The reason why they want to defang the courts is because the courts are the last bastion of defense. The Republican Party's 40-year project has been to undermine the legislative body, right? Through gridlock, through permanent obstruction. They recognized, especially after Mitch McConnell's takeover under the Obama administration, they realized that they wouldn't even get punished by their voters for consistently engaging in obstruction. Political parties are totally polarized at this point. It doesn't matter. Their base of support cares about ridiculous nonsense like culture war issues and whatnot. They don't care about anything else. Okay? And therefore, there is no power in Congress. There's no more power in Congress whatsoever. So a lot of these decisions that change, I guess, de facto change legislation without actually changing federal legislation comes from the state legislatures, which are much easier to dominate through gerrymandering. Okay? So they oftentimes will take unconstitutional decisions or ridiculous right-wing bills and present it at the state level. And then at the state level, the only way to combat these decisions is through the justice system. But the justice system is still an independent body within the separation of powers. So they've already destroyed they have already destroyed the power that Congress has effectively. And now they legislate by state legislatures. And now the only way to stop state legislatures is in the hands of the justice system. So that's the last hurdle that they have to clear. So they're now trying to defang the power of the courts. They are, on the one hand, packing the courts, but on the other, they're still getting injunctions issued against them. So they have to also defang the courts in the interim, only to turn around and I guess like completely rebuild the courts in their own vision. But they haven't gotten there yet. A lot of this makes sense when you realize that Republicans don't care about the institutions or the preservation of institutions. They just want to wield power. Their understanding of politics is more sincere and more ruthless and more brutally honest than the liberal Democrat Party's approach is. Okay? The Democratic Party's approach is about preserving the sanctity of institutions. They have this ridiculous notion. That people care about this sort of thing when playing the game of politics. Politics is not about that. No one gives a about the rules. Okay? Politics is about power. It's about distribution of resources. It's about who gets to do violence and who are the targets of said violence, who gets to have the resources and who doesn't get to have the resources. That's how politics works. And Republicans understand that. And they actually do have the capacity to build decades long. They have the capacity to build on a vision that will solidify power at the top, at the executive, knowing full well that the Democrats, once they are in power, will never wield the executive authority in the same way that Republicans do. And if you want to consolidate power at the executive, you have to take care of all of the hurdles that come your way. And part of that is going to be, in the separation of powers, the courts. It's that simple. Yes, effectively a dictatorship.
Wait for individuals to sue one by one to challenge the constitutionality for such an order.
Jeff, sometimes the justices and the way they ask their questions, they show a little bit of how they're feeling about a particular issue. Do you see that in the questions we're seeing so far from the justices?
Yeah, not as to the merits, but as to the leanings towards a nationwide injunction. I count at least 3 justices, Sotomayor, Kagan, and Jackson, who are hostile to any attack on nationwide injunctions, and maybe Barrett. The question is, will there be 5 justices who are willing to strike down nationwide injunctions in this case or in general?
Selena, and I know you're watching some protests outside the court. What are you hearing from demonstrators there?
Yeah, Diane, not too far from where we are now, outside of the Supreme Court, there's a group of protesters, and I spoke to folks who traveled from across the country, including a sizable group that came from California, and they're protesting not only the administration's stance on birthright citizenship, but also the president's immigration.
What is going on today? I love Asmongold. You're a loser, Hassan. You birch. I don't get it. Like, what? I don't understand what this does. Like, what do you think is happening here? You know, he called me a tree. But like, I don't understand why people come in here to do this. Like, what the purpose of this is. Like, do you think this is, you know, do you think this causes people to be like, you know what, that guy's got some good points? Like, you think that's what's going on? You know? How do you always manage to pinpoint these chatters? How are you going to snipe that and not our new friend who saw the light law? I didn't see the person who saw the light. Whippinator, thank you for the 5 gifted subs. Don't streamers get in trouble when their audiences harasses other streamers? Come on, chatter. Let's be real. Let's be real.
And deportation plans overall. Now, I spoke to one young woman who is the daughter of undocumented migrants. She said this case, of course, hits at home. She said she wants to be here to send a message that they all have a voice, that she's a proud American. I spoke to another young woman who is a first-generation daughter of immigrants.
So I used to be an Asmongold fan. He's been talking nonsense lately. Eventually, people will come to their senses. That's what I believe. That's it. Just like I believe that people have the capacity to maintain charity, no matter how much the well has been poisoned against things that I'm saying or who I am. I think that people still have the capacity to self-reflect. People still have the capacity to recognize right from wrong. People still have the capacity to change their opinions. I value that. I don't hold people to positions that they had in the past. It is not what I believe. It's one of the major principles that I defend over and over again, that reform is possible, rehabilitation is possible, people can change their minds, and I will continue offering charity to those who do.
Immigrants from Mexico, and she's currently a college student. Take a listen to what she told me about why she's here.
We love the United States, and we've been working here for so many years. We've been able to help other communities in our surrounding areas for little to nothing back, any benefits at all. To me, I'm proud to say that I'm a daughter of immigrant parents, the first in my family to go to university, first to graduate from high school as well, second in my class, and I'm proud to say that my sister is the valedictorian in my class as well. So we are living proof that we've been able to do great things coming to this country, to not only provide for ourselves, but to provide to other people.
And we heard the justices ask some of the procedural and logistical questions. Immigration advocates are arguing that if this nationwide injunction is narrowed, that it could cause some real chaos on the ground, because there could be a situation where kids born in some states are considered U.S. citizens, but in other states they are not. So you could see a case of families trying to get to states where their newborn child will be considered U.S. citizens, and that could create overwhelmed hospitals along the border and questions about paperwork, regulations. A lot is up in the air.
All right, Selena Wang, Jeff Lewis, thank you both.
And the South African government and refugee advocates are rebuking the Trump administration for welcoming 59 white South Africans as refugees. The president told...
I love this story. I do have to mention a couple things here, okay? I briefly talked about this. I briefly talked about this like yesterday and day prior. Number one, I don't care that we are bringing in, white farmers from South Africa. Okay, I think it's so marginal, it's so silly, it's not significant. I do, however, know exactly why the administration is doing this. It's to basically give a nod to the white nationalists, to say like, yeah, white genocide is happening. Asman is kind of a monster now. I used to relate to the, mid-30s gamer loner dude. You can call him Mr. Reasonable, but you still, like, at least think about stuff. And, now he's just corrupt. I feel like maybe he's just like that all alone now. It's okay to be such a monster. I don't know. As a South African, I find it so funny because the only thing those people are running away from is the rant here. Yeah, so what's really funny about this also is that... white people in South Africa live a pretty good life, as opposed to the experiences that they will enjoy here in the United States of America with no social safety nets whatsoever and an affordability crisis that they're now facing. I think it's really funny, and they will most likely turn back and go to South Africa. Okay, so. That's one part. That's one part of this. Okay, they'll go back to the genocidal state of South Africa that's doing a white genocide, right? Like if we were to take it seriously. A couple points to touch on here. One, white genocide is not real. It's not happening. It's not happening in South Africa. It's just a white nationalist dog whistle. It's bullshit. Okay, it's not real at all. It's so not real that like Elon Musk seemingly tried to change the output of Grok, it's his own AI on Twitter, to say otherwise, and completely bricked his own AI and had to stop it for a little bit yesterday when people figured it out. It's just, why are you okay with appeasing white nationalist policy? Stop being okay with bad policy because it's small. No, because I think in the grand scheme of things, this is utterly irrelevant. I think that the real vector of harm here is not bringing in a bunch of inbred boars from South Africa that are going to have a shitty time in the United States of America as a way to posture towards white nationalists and as a way to legitimize claims that are being made about white genocide happening in South Africa, when the government is also blackbacking immigrants at every, from every avenue here and shipping them off to a slave labor colony. That's why. You're wrong, mate. So wrong. Yeah, I know. I'm wrong. It's real. White genocide is real in South Africa. And also, every single person that presents this will immediately get incredibly racist and go, it's going to turn into Zimbabwe. What is this? Oh, shit. What does this mean? Moiti uppity runs away racistly. Yeah, chatters here have to accept that there's a difference between small and significant and truly inconsequential. This is absolutely changing nothing here in America. It's changing nothing in South Africa either. It's just a performative move to offer red meat to the white nationalists, okay? And the far more consequential immigration enforcement agenda here is happening at the point of detention and refusing due process.
Democracy depends on a free press. Please support our independent
let's start with democracy now.
The United States Monday, after being granted refugee status. Afrikaners are the white South Africans who ruled the country during apartheid. This comes as the Trump administration has suspended refugee resettlement for almost everyone else in the world. Speaking Monday, Trump claimed white South Africa.
I guess the you're wrong argument is about accepting racist Afrikaners. Like, yeah, it's performative, but I guess it can be used to have a point of reference on immigration that the U.S. considers acceptable and challenge it on race discrimination grounds. Oh no, I'm gonna bring that up. Hold on, I'm gonna get to it. I'm saying in the grand scheme of things, it's ultimately utterly inconsequential. But what is actually consequential about it is what the government is signaling. Okay, that's it.
Face racial discrimination, even though the country's white minority still owns the vast majority of farmland decades after the end of apartheid rule. Trump said he's...
Look at these boars, they're cheeseburger hogs already. No, they are so perfect. When the Trump administration has unique moments of honesty, well, I guess it's not so unique. They're openly racist usually. And say things like, well, these guys actually are the exact kind of refugees that we want in this country because they are, they're perfectly accepting of American culture. They're not wrong. It's just more so a self-own when you say that. Yeah, they brought in dudes that are virtually indistinguishable from the racist American fat hogs that you see at Walmart on a regular basis. Their opinions also resemble the racist, heart-diseased Amerifats. So it's perfect. It's perfect in that regard. You know? It's an indictment on American culture, not an indictment on anything else.
He's allowing them to come to the United States to escape, quote, genocide.
It's a genocide that's taking place that you people don't want to write about, but it's a terrible thing that's taking place, and farmers are being killed. They happen to be white. But whether they're white or black makes no difference to me. But white farmers are being brutally killed, and their land is being confiscated in South Africa.
On Monday, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa refuted Trump's claims that white people are being persecuted in his country, calling it, quote, a completely false narrative. On Tuesday, Ramaphosa recounted a conversation he'd had with Trump about the situation in his country.
I had a conversation with President Trump on the phone, and he said, what's happening down there? And I said, President, what you've been told by those people who are opposed to transformation back home in South Africa is not true. And I added to him, I said, we were well taught by Nelson Mandela and other iconic leaders like Oliver Tambo on how to continue to build a united nation out of the diverse groupings that we have in South Africa. We're the only country on the continent where the colonizers came to stay, and we have never driven them out of our country. So they are staying, and they're making great progress. It's a fringe grouping that does not have a lot of support, that is anti-transformation and anti-change, that would actually prefer to see South Africa going back to apartheid type of policies.
This comes as South African-born Trump advisor and multi-billionaire Elon Musk has also accused South Africa's government of promoting what he calls white genocide. Musk's grandfather moved his family to South Africa after embracing the country's apartheid system.
On Wednesday, Musk's artificial intelligence chatbot, Grok, became a trending topic on X when people tried to use it to answer questions and check facts. And the chatbot
You don't think this was an Elon request? No, I think it is. It certainly is. Sounds like something a president committing white genocide would say. Dude. If the impact of white genocide is that white people own 90% of the land, wow, dude. What an incredible version of white genocide. Like, hold on. Doors open. It's so, yeah. Famously, that's what happened during the Holocaust, right? Or the Armenian genocide. I was memeing, bro. Please don't put me on blast. Like, even in the aftermath of the dissolution of the apartheid, you know, whites in South Africa still own like 90% of the most valuable land in South Africa and 75% of all farmland.
Added the topic of white genocide in South Africa to its responses, telling users it was, quote, instructed by my creators to accept the genocide, quote, as real and racially motivated, no matter what the question was. For more, we're joined in Cape Town, South Africa by two guests. Herman Wasserman is with us, professor of journalism, director of the Center for Information Integrity in Africa at Stella.
Does he know that he's under threat? Maybe he's saying, maybe he's saying there's no genocide because he's under threat. There's a gun pointed at him. As a white guy in South Africa, does this guy not know?
Stellenbosch University. His new piece for the website Africa is a Country is headlined Trump's Fake Refugees. Wasserman himself is a white South African, an Afrikaner. And Andile Zulu is a political analyst with the Alternative Information and Development Center. His new piece for the website Africa is a Country is titled Race, Power, and the Politics of Distraction. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Herman Wasserman, let's begin with you. You are a white South African and you are an Afrikaner. If you can explain, first of all, to the world what exactly that means and what you thought when you heard President Trump charge white genocide in South Africa.
Well, I would say that my first response was one of incredulity, and later met with, I think with disgust even, and just rejection of this notion of a white genocide or whites being persecuted. And I think that view is shared by many others, white South Africans, and certainly the majority of South Africans in the country.
Well, Andile Zulu, if you could also respond to these claims of a white genocide in South Africa and Trump bringing over these 59 Afrikaners to the U.S., and talk about this in the context of this the new law that replaces the 1975 Expropriation Act in South Africa, and explain why that's been so controversial and what it entails.
Well, this accusation of white genocide emanating from the White House is a conspiracy theory and a myth that has been floating around echo chambers of right-wing populists and white nationalists for many decades now, particularly within the online space. And it essentially holds the accusation that white South Africa...
This is literally Lauren Southern shit. Like, things that under Trump 1, neo-Nazis were narratives that neo-Nazis were trying to advance under the first Trump term have now become official state-sanctioned policy, which of course is incredibly scary in its own right and should not be cast aside. It's just that like the impact of said policy is utterly inconsequential, but that doesn't mean that this isn't the state trying to legitimize a completely made up white nationalist conspiracy. And it's particularly insane to do it at a time when the American state is doing a genocide in Gaza. They are responsible for a real genocide in Gaza right now. Part of this also, this is twofold. Part of it is to also punish the state that actually called into question America's vehicle of doing genocide in Gaza. South Africa, as you guys know, launched the international criminal justice court case against Israel conducting a genocide. So this is supposed to be like some kind of no you at the global stage from the United States of America, utilizing the influence that it, or the remaining influence that it has on the international stage. But of course, I don't think it's consequential or serious because no one believes this bullshit. The only people that believe this bullshit are motivated to believe this bullshit because they themselves are white nationalists.
Africans, in particular Afrikaans South Africans, are victims of deliberate, direct, state-sanctioned violence. And anyone who lives in this country, who's awake to the reality of this country, the inequality, the poverty, the unemployment that most Black South Africans have to endure, and including Indian and colored South Africans as well, knows that it's patently untrue. And the truth, however, is irrelevant to those who are perpetuating this myth. What matters is that it's a means through which you can mobilize anxiety, mobilize fear, and mobilize frustration from a segment, I think a relatively small segment of the population that is dissatisfied with the post-apartheid democracy and the loss of their political elevated status. It's a way in which you can mobilize fears here in South Africa and then appeal to a base within the MAGA movement in the US as well to portray the Donald Trump presidency as essentially being a crusader to defend white civilization, both in the USA and here. And this all began initially with the signing by the president, Ramaphosa, of the Expropriation Act, which in itself is not that much of a radical or progressive policy. It's a very procedural piece of legislation, which essentially changes the criteria through which government can expropriate private property for the public good and for the public use on the basis of finding just and equitable compensation. And in fact, most legal experts have said that the instances in which you'll arrive at nil compensation, at no compensation, would be quite rare, actually. So this legislation isn't an assault on white livelihoods. It isn't even an attack on the dominance of private property relations in post-apartheid. But for Elon Musk and for Donald Trump, it's doing what right-wing populism, what racial ideologies always function to do, which is to stoke fear, conflict, and division in order to be able to protect the exploitative and unequal relations under South Africa's neoliberal capitalism, and I think under the neoliberal order that we have more broadly.
Yeah. The biggest L in post-apartheid South Africa was dropping the revolutionary socialist principles that the ANC operated off of, that did not engage in restorative justice when it came to the economic inequalities. And these economic inequalities persisted in South Africa, which created a de facto apartheid state from the basis of the improvement of Black people's lives in South Africa. There was no economic change. Now, of course, there's reasons for why this didn't happen. Obviously, they were like, come on, we gave you your rights, shut the f up. America is no stranger to undermining Reconstruction, considering that they undermine America, the federal government undermined its own efforts of finding a peaceable solution to the system of slavery that exists, this chattel slavery that existed, and very quickly took on efforts to restore the previous racial hierarchies by unleashing the Klan, for example, and destroying any kind of economic restitution opportunities for black people that were newly freed. So a similar issue took place in post-apartheid South Africa.
I mean, I just want to add these a couple of things that I wanted to say earlier, which is to clarify for audiences who aren't as aware of South Africa's history. It was a 1913 law that gave over 90% of South Africa's land to whites. Today, they are some 7% of the population are white South Africans, but they still own about half, 50% of the country's land. Afrikaners, who constitute the majority of the white population, are among, of course, the most successful and richest in South Africa. So if you could explain, Andile, how has this news, Trump's statement, the fact that these 59 people have now arrived,
Post-apartheid South African conditions for black people and white people resembles America so perfectly, because if I'm not mistaken, I think like every single person that was the wealthiest in South Africa in apartheid South Africa were white, and then post-apartheid South Africa there was one black guy, and then the rest are still white. And the material circumstances of black South Africans did not change. Like, they had more civil liberties, but ultimately they were still living in dire poverty. So all it did was uplift, I guess, one dude, and then that's it. And I don't mean literally only one guy, but it basically creates this notion, it creates this false reality that, the end of the apartheid brought about complete black liberation, where, yeah, sure, some black people were now allowed to be elevated into the capital owning class, and yet the same system of discrimination changed hands from direct de jure discrimination of black people to a de facto discrimination of black people from the point of class.
in the U.S. How has that been received in South Africa, this news?
I think it's been a mixture of frustration and bewilderment and just real confusion as to what is the basis of the idea that white South Africans, in particular Afrikaners, are being persecuted. And as you said, South Africa in the post-apartheid, the past 30 years of democracy that we have, comes out of a history of a white supremacist regime, which not only dispossessed people of color of their land, but also then set up a rigorous economic system of exploitation to ensure the underdevelopment of black people, Indians and coloreds included, to be able to amass economic and political power. Now, if you just look, for example, at the statistics that we have on the racial manifestations of inequality in this country, it's quite clear that this myth of white genocide and of white persecution has no basis in reality. For example, the unemployment rate amongst white South Africans sits at 7.9%.
Why are they mad white people are leaving? White supremacists are leaving? They're not. I'm not. They're mad that the American government is literally lying about a white genocide taking place in South Africa. That's it. This person is here to correct the record.
As compared to 36.9% for black South Africans. The poverty rate for white South Africans sits at 1% as compared to 64% for South Africans. And in fact, the people who are the victims of violence by and large due to organized crime and due to the symptoms of societal dysfunction are largely young black men and young black women. If you are a young black person in the place where I live, in Cape Town, and you live in a township in a rural area, you are 16 times more likely to be a victim of homicide as compared to a white South African. But however, it's just important to clarify that white South Africans, of course, because we are all living in a country that has many issues and many crises, are still, of course, victims of violent crime, of state dysfunction, of economic anxiety and of financial precarity, but they are not victims of those things but because they are white. Those issues are a symptom of a larger dysfunction due to an incapacitated state run by kleptocrats trying to enforce neoliberalism on an increasingly dysfunctional economy. So it's quite important to say that the myth of white genocide has no basis in reality. However, South Africa is facing crises, the three crises of mass unemployment, of inequality, and of poverty. And those results from the choices, the bad policy choices that the ANC has made since 1996, which is essentially an abiding commitment to neoliberal policy, the kinds of policies which are causing the crises that we see in the United States and in many parts of the world as well.
I wanted to go back to Professor Herman Wasserman. Here in the United States, powerful group of men around Trump, known often as the PayPal Mafia, co-founders and members of PayPal, extend to apartheid South Africa. Its members, Elon Musk, co-founder of PayPal with Peter Thiel, along with David Sachs and Roelof Botha. So you have this situation where most refugees in the world are not allowed into the United States right now, where refugees are being thrown out of the United States. But you have this group on Monday of 59 white South African Afrikaners arriving in the United States after being granted refugee status. Can you talk about this small group around Trump and what they mean for Trump's worldview right now and what it means that these refugees are brought here? Did it get much attention in South Africa? I shouldn't say refugees, but these white South African Afrikaners.
Yes, I think many South African media outlets refer to these refugees in inverted commas because I think that is the general understanding that they are not really refugees. As you have pointed out, it flies in the face of the really dire and tragic circumstances that many people around the world live under, and that would be much more eligible for refugee status. In fact, as Andile has pointed out, this whole refugee status is based on disinformation. It's based on a disinformation campaign. And so some of it, it's hard, of course, to pinpoint exactly what happened first. One could argue that some of these white former South Africans around Donald Trump would have had his ear and would have maybe helped him tapped into this sort of narrative of white persecution. They also represent to him maybe white South Africans who have left the country and have sought their fortunes elsewhere. And but I think what is also important to recognize is that this has also been the result of a concerted effort by some Afrikaner lobby groups over many years to fan that idea that South African, white South Africans, especially Afrikaners, are being persecuted. There have been a consistent campaign by the Afrikaner rights group AfriForum, who have been pushing that narrative for many years. They have lobbied Washington. They have met Republican officials. They've appeared on conservative media outlets like the Tucker Carlson show. They've extended their road shows to conservative think tanks and conferences in Europe, like CPAC in Hungary. And in all these places, they painted a dire picture of South Africa, where white farmers are supposedly under constant attack, where they're singled out for violence. They are on the verge of losing their land, that they are unfairly being targeted by a corrupt and totalitarian government which discriminates against them in what they would call a type of reverse apartheid. And all of this was very deftly wrapped up in a communication strategy that then eventually found sympathetic ears among US conservatives. And I think with these men around white, former South Africans around Trump, which would have amplified that to him. And now with this so-called refugee campaign, their communication campaign over these many years, their lobbying has finally paid off. I think in terms of the South African media, there have been a range of responses, but I think by and large, people recognize that this has no basis in reality. As Andile said, this is based on a disinformation campaign. Some of the conservative elements in the society might find that now somebody has listened to their complaints and taken that seriously. But anybody who really has their basis in factual reality would know that this is a ruse, that this is a disinformation campaign, and that actually these little group of so-called refugees are pawns in a much larger political campaign, a campaign both domestically in the US, where Trump is using them as really as pawns, as props in a campaign that purports to promote whiteness and whiteness under threat, and also geopolitically. In his executive order, which granted this refugee status to Afrikaners, it was juxtaposed very closely with criticism of South Africa for taking Israel to the ICJ. So this can clearly...
Dude, it's nuts. I feel like Israeli interests are so pervasive in every orifice of American policy, especially foreign policy. And sometimes I feel like I'm going crazy when analyzing these situations. Like, as I told you, this guy is right. The reason why they're doing this is partially because the reason why send ANC to Mars, Elon, thank you, Trump, no to land and property expropriation with their compensation. Please stop legalize racism. Send ANC to Mars.
Also be seen as a message to South Africa to punish them for their stance on Israel and Israel's war on Gaza and the US's involvement and support of that war. So I think one has to understand that this is, although this group of Afrikaners might be the tokens, might be the people propped up in front of the cameras in this media event, that they are actually pawns and props in a much larger domestic and political campaign for Trump, and also domestically in South Africa for a group of Afrikaners who actually do not have any intention to leave. AfriForum and these groups said that they do not want to leave. In other words, this is really a power play for them domestically as well, to force the South African government to take their complaints more seriously, to take their claims to privilege more seriously. So it is not really about that group of 49 or however many refugees.
And of course, the U.S. threw out the South African ambassador to the United States as well, as President Trump goes after universities that talk about structural and historical racism in the United States. Herman Wasserman, I want to thank you for being.
So, yeah, we got a shipment of racist-ass token whites, self-selected,